Podcast. Today I am joined with Joseph Agu from Elite Nutrition Coaching. Hello, Joe.
Hi Ian, thanks very much for having me on.
Before we get into today's topic, if you wouldn't mind giving the listeners a little bit of an introduction to who you are.
Yes, certainly. It's probably best to start from the top, really. So, in my background in education, so I did a sport and exercise science degree at the University of Chester, and then followed that up a year later with a master's in sports nutrition. I graduated with a master's in around 2011. So since then, I've started with an online nutrition consultancy business, then went into the English Institute of Sport, working with British Athletics, and started a PhD as well at Bangor University. I've finished with those now. So as of 2015, I've been focused purely on my rebrand essentially of my nutrition consultancy, which is now Elite Nutrition Coaching. So I continue to work with some athletes, but majority of my clients are range from just your average gym goer um, to elite athletes and some bodybuilders and some fitness figure competitors and so on. So that's pretty much a summary of where I'm at the minute.
That's super duper. So today's topic, we're going to talk all about protein. And first and foremost, we're just going to talk as simple and maybe get onto some other topics such as like supplementation and veganism and vegetarians and whatnot, timing, quality and quantity. So to start off, what is protein and why is it important, Joseph?
Protein's one of the three macronutrients, so the other two are fat and carbohydrate. But there's only two essential macronutrients. Protein and is one of them, fat's the other. Carbohydrate you can actually make from, well, you can make from protein essentially by the breakdown of glucogenic amino acids. But that's something we can get into later if we want to discuss that. But protein's important because it's the only source of dietary nitrogen. It's the only nitrogen source available to humans, so it needs to be consumed in sufficient amounts in order to support life. So that's the general importance. One of them is that it's essential for life. The second one, if it is lacking, because the main roles of it in terms of the health are to maintain sort of muscle mass, ensure that different reactions in the body and metabolism are undergoing at a normal rate. From a performance side of things, it's important to gain muscle mass. Proteins alongside the training and total calories are going to be the three primary determinants of whether someone gains muscle mass or not. So that's protein in a nutshell. It's an essential nutrient which has got a few important factors surrounding it.
So when it comes to protein, what would you kind of say there's the hierarchy of importance? Would you say it's quantity first and foremost that we're looking at as a whole across the diet?
Yeah, of course it depends on someone's goal, but first and foremost, yeah, if you had to do a pyramid, and I did like a protein hierarchy pyramid for a blog post and a Facebook post I did at one time. So if you imagine, if you go from the most important to the least important at the top, so the most important would be the total daily protein. So that's the total amount of protein you consume within a given day. What's next most important would be how you distribute that throughout the day. Then protein quality comes below that, and then protein timing would be the least important factor. So in terms of the total daily amount, it depends entirely on the population. So I'll let you sort of dig into who you wanna address first and foremost, Ian.
So we'll just talk about like kind of baseline average Joe who doesn't go to the gym, who doesn't have any real kind of stress from training.
Yeah. So the RDA, which is the recommended daily allowance, so the way that's worked out is the safe minimum to avoid deficiency, and that would be sufficient for around 97 to 98% of the population. And that total amount would be around zero point 0.8 grams per kilo. So for sort of 60k female would be around 48 grams or around that mark, whereas an 80k male, it'd be a bit closer to around the sort of 60 plus grams per day, which isn't all that much, especially compared to the amount that bodybuilders and some fitness competitors consume.
Are these generally based on like lean body mass or actual body weight?
These are based on body weight, yeah. So they're quite old, these recommendations, but when they've been revised, they haven't really changed too much. But a caveat to those minimum recommendations, there's some research, especially in the last sort of 7 or 8 years, that's shown that RDA, that 0.8 grams per kilo per day of body mass, isn't sufficient for some populations. One of those populations is the elderly. So when people age, oftentimes they get something called sarcopenia, which is technically an age-related reduction in muscle mass. And part of the contribution to that is a reduction in anabolic signaling. That basically become less sensitive to the effects of protein, so you need more to achieve the same effect. So for the elderly, then probably around the 1.2 grams, so around 50% more would be ideal. In terms of the practicality, it becomes difficult as well, because one of the things goes when you're older is appetite, especially towards protein. So there's a double whammy in a sense that it's more difficult to hit that minimum requirement anyway, and then that minimum requirement is actually elevated. So oftentimes for a lot of elderly, especially those with sarcopenia, then a protein supplement would be a good choice to try to hit that minimum requirement there. Another population where the sort of 0.8 grams per kilo might not be enough is probably vegans, just because of the lower protein quality and the lower absorption. So in reality, they might be only absorbing 0.7 grams of that, and because of the protein quality reduced, they need to essentially compensate by increasing the amount of protein.
Would it be so with children, would that be similar to 0.8 grams per kilo as well?
With children, it's I haven't looked at the research in a while, but it's usually higher because they are growing and because they're quite light anyway. So it's I'd probably say double is about a safe amount for a child. If you imagine like a small boy or girl around sort of 30 kilos, then consuming around the 1.6 mark is only going to give you around sort of 48 grams per day anyway, which isn't all that much, and most kids would naturally eat that. It's the equivalent of like a couple of chicken breasts or something like that, so it isn't all that much at all. So I don't think, unless children have got a really poor diet, which is mostly going to be the parents' responsibility, then the children are most likely going to hit their protein requirements.
Yeah. As far as the elderly, is there kind of like an age range? Because obviously elderly could be anything from, some people in the 50s consider themselves elderly or whatnot. Is there generally?
Yeah, I'd say it's a bit of a grey area in the literature because they haven't really identified the
you
exact
don't all
age.
of a sudden turn 60 and
just
go, right,
and then,
it's 12 o'clock. Let's get an extra scoop of whey in.
Yeah, if it was that straightforward, but probably around the sort of 60 mark, it'd probably around the late 50s to sort of early 60s where things would start reducing in terms of that anabolic response to food. But one of the things that will keep your body younger essentially and mitigate that reduction in anabolic sensitivity is just resistance training, exercise in general, staying relatively lean. All factors that anyone would do to stay healthy would minimize that sort of negative adaptation. Some of it will probably happen to a degree, but it should be reduced to to a degree if you look after yourself.
Yeah. So like obviously that leads us to kind of the trained population if they are partaking in these activities that create a healthier body, as does their protein requirements need to kind of match. Yeah.
Yeah, so for if you split it into endurance and then sort of more resistance trained athletes, so for endurance, it's probably around the 1.2 to 1.8 gram per kilo mark that's sufficient to optimize the adaptations. And because there's a greater need of protein and endurance athletes, one of them is because you end up burning a little bit more just through the exercise, and the second one is it helps the adaptation, so the mitochondrial biogenesis, which is making of the new mitochondria within the muscles and upregulating all those factors, improving protein synthesis, so you're recovering better from the exercise that you're doing. So around the 1.2 to 1.8 for endurance athletes. For strength trained athletes, it doesn't vary too much. So of the sort of last 25 years, and an article I did, I mapped all the protein recommendations that have been given in every review for strength trained athletes over the sort of last 25 years. And the first one by Lemon, I think was 91, it was 1.4 to 2.2. The most recent one, which came out early this year, or I think maybe last year, was 1.7 to 2.2. So over the past 20 years, it hasn't really changed that much. The bottom end's just increased a little bit. So a safe bet with that, I'd probably say between 1.8 to 2.2 for strength athletes, and maybe the 1.6 to around 2 for endurance athletes. Those requirements will probably increase if someone is in an energy deficit, so if someone's looking to lose body fat. And the reason for that is because some of that protein is going to be used for fuel, and if there's more protein floating around the body from extra that's ingested, your body's more likely to use that than to tap into the protein, which forms the muscles. So it's got a muscle sparing effect. And a review by Eric Helms, and this was 2013, he showed that those requirements go from around the sort of 2 to 3.1 grams per kilo of lean body mass, and that would probably be the equivalent of probably around the 2 to around 2.7 grams per kilo of actual body mass. And those are not too dissimilar from those by Stu Phillips and Luc Van Loon in their review in 2011 that showed that that they recommend around 1.8 to 2.7 grams per kilo for those under dieting conditions. So, so to just summarize that a bit quickly, so for endurance athletes, probably around the 1.6 to 2 grams per kilo. For strength trained athletes, around the 1.8 to 2.2 mark. And if someone's dieting, then you probably want to bump up another, say, 20% on top of that. So maybe like the 2 to around 2.5, 2.6 grams per kilo is a safe estimate.
Excellent. So when we're talking about like protein quality, and you mentioned veganism prior, so I'm assuming we're talking about meat being the meat and whey being the kind of the best quality source of protein there is available.
Yeah. So when we're talking about protein, when we're speaking of protein, firstly, there's many ways of determining protein quality, but one of the most simple and most relevant to muscle anabolism is the quantity of leucine and other branched chain amino acids in a given protein source. So that leucine percentage is probably, if you were to isolate a key factor within a protein source to determine quality, that would probably be the most simple way of doing it. And animal protein, so like you say, whey, milk, casein, beef, egg, chicken, and so on, they tend to have a higher leucine concentration than more plant-based sources like potato, wheat, oats, pea, lentils, and stuff like that. And the reason for that is because to optimize protein synthesis, which is the making of new muscle tissue, there needs to be a minimum amount of protein consumed to essentially result in the maximum response of protein synthesis, and that would be the equivalent of around 2 to 3 grams of a leucine containing meal. So, for example, to hit the 3 grams of leucine with a whey isolate, you'd only need around 23 grams of whey protein. Whereas potato, for example, you'd need 58 grams of protein to hit that 3 grams. And stuff like soy, you'd need around 38, quinoa around 43, wheat around the 45. So you can see that in order to hit that minimum or that leucine threshold to maximize protein synthesis, the amount of protein you're going to need is going to be sometimes significantly more than from an animal-based protein source. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily set someone up for failure if they are a vegan or a vegetarian. It just means that they either need to consume more of the inferior quality protein source or fortify that protein source with added leucine. So you could still eat maybe 30 grams of soy protein, but if you add a gram or two of leucine and supplement form to that, in theory at least, it should perform similarly to an animal-based protein source. So that would be my recommendations for a vegan looking to essentially bump up their quality and make best use of their protein rather than just going consuming, say, 50% more protein, which is going to be quite difficult.
Yeah, and expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just on a side note, if people are going to supplement with leucine, I would recommend tablet form because it tastes...
It's disgusting.
It's the worst tasting thing I think I've ever had. So I've still got a bag of it downstairs. So, right, where were we up to? So next in line is kind of, did you say protein timing? That's the next sort of thing that should be considered.
Yeah. So, well, before the quality distribution, depending on the context, either quality or distribution could be the next most important. For someone like a vegan, then quality would become more important than distribution. Although, for say, in general, for someone who's consuming an animal-based diet, quality generally isn't that much of a concern. So protein distribution is probably the most relevant there. And as the sort of name says, when we talk about distributing, it's how we split that total protein in a given day. And there's two ways of doing that. So, well, firstly, we need to know what the minimum dose we need for a given meal, and then a maximum dose. And the best way to go about that is work out the minimum effective dose for an increase in protein synthesis, and it's around 20 grams that the researchers teased out, whereas the maximum tends to be around the 40-gram mark. To date, there's been no research showing a greater muscle protein synthesis response from a protein quantity greater than 40 grams. So around 20 to 30 grams is the sweet spot. As a conservative measure, probably around the 30 to 40 grams. So if we know that's the amount per meal that we should be having, and we know the total amount, we simply just divide the total daily amount into doses of around 30 to 40 grams and spread those evenly throughout the day, because that's going to give you the most robust protein synthesis response, and it's going to continually do that throughout the day in terms of like a pulsing, rather than just having that at one or two meals, which, yeah, you'll get that response in those given meals, but then for the rest of the day, protein breakdown might exceed protein synthesis, which wouldn't. You might not lose muscle because it depends on the calorie balance of the total protein, but it would be, in theory, more difficult to gain muscle.
Mm-hmm. And obviously, the protein that we're intaking, it doesn't have to be perfect. You know, if people are dividing their quantity by 4, is there an ideal kind of amount of distributions and a timing between meals that you would recommend?
Yeah, in terms of so if we think how long a meal's going to maintain an anabolic response, so if you consume a meal containing around sort of 30, 40 grams of carbs, 30, 40 grams of protein, around 20 grams of fat, which is typical of a quite a standard meal, then you're going to get an elevation in protein synthesis, which is going to last beyond the sort of 4-hour mark. And those amino acids, therefore, are going to be still absorbing into the bloodstream well over sort of 4 or 5, even 6 hours if a larger intake of proteins eaten. So every sort of four hours or so would be ideal. Every 4 to 5 hours. If it's closer than that, that's fine. But as a minimum, I'd say around 3 hours. As a maximum, around 5 hours is a safe bet. So that would typically give around 3 to 5 meals per day with most realistic protein servings. So if we take a 80k male, for example, and they're consuming 2 grams per kilo per day, so that's 160 grams of protein. If that's over 4 to 5 meals every 4 or 5 hours, so that would be, for example, 30 grams at 7 a.m., maybe before a gym session or after a gym session, another 30 grams at 11, 30 grams at 3, 30 grams at 7, and then just to round up to the 160, 40 grams at, say, 11 p.m. before bed, just to help the absorption throughout the night. And there's some evidence mounting around that and the sort of pre-bed intakes and around casein and stuff, and we can touch on that after we finish this point if you want. And if we were to do just the 4 meals per day every 5 hours, then you could go 40 grams at 7, same again at 12, 5, and then 10. So there's different ways of splitting it. But I'd try to maintain a minimum of around 25 grams in a given meal.
So we don't need 8 to 10 feedings per day?
No. And a lot of that's come from the sort of bodybuilding law, and you've got to eat every 2 hours. But there's some research to suggest that might be suboptimal because some people make out that there's there is a refractory response to protein synthesis. And so there was a study, I can't remember the authors' names, but they infused amino acids essentially into the bloodstream, and they, after a certain time period, they noticed that muscle protein synthesis was maximized. They continued to infuse the same amount, but protein synthesis declined. So despite the provision of a continuous amino acid stream, protein synthesis did drop. So in reality, if someone were consuming protein every 2 hours, you would get a similar effect. It's going to come down. So in theory, if you let the protein synthesis come down, say over sort of like the 3 to 5 hour mark, and then have that ingestion again, it's going to create a more robust response the second time. There isn't really any research to back that up. It's just a theory based around the refractory response. There's been no research showing that you can circumvent that response by extending the meal out, because like I said, there's research showing that protein synthesis is still elevated for around the 5 hour mark. So according to that theory, you might need to wait sort of 6 to 7 hours between meals, and in reality that's only going to give you 2 meals per day then. So there's been plenty of people who've eaten 2 to 3 meals per day. There's been people who've eaten 6 to 8 meals per day, so they've got decent results. So it goes to show that by far the most important factor is the total daily amount, and then these other factors we're just trying to optimize based on what we know according to the research. The importance of that is going to be far less than the total amount. So if you're going to nail anything, nail the total amount, and then just trying to divide that up throughout the day from decent protein sources as a decent one-liner in terms of implementing the information.
So like if we look at just quantity, just for last time, what is obviously the problems with people who are pursuing some sort of physique or performance goal under eating protein?
So if they're not getting enough, what would be the impact?
Yeah.
One of them, depending on how hard they train and whether their calories are sufficient. If their calories are insufficient, then they are likely not to adapt to the training. So the recovery and the adaptation following the training bouts wouldn't be sufficient. So they'd plateau. They wouldn't make the same gains as if they consumed enough protein and calories. They could also lose muscle. There's been plenty of people who have trained hard, but because they're not consuming much protein or calories are low as well, then they end up losing muscle mass. But generally, under recovery is the main one. a lack of satiety perhaps as well, because protein's the most satiating macronutrient. If someone is dieting, then it's another benefit beyond the sort of recovery and adaptation and the muscle protein synthesis response is that it makes you feel fuller for longer. So that's certainly an advantage during dieting.
Totally. And at the other end of the spectrum in the media, there's been all of this talk of kidney issues with too high of a protein intake. Is there any negatives from, apart from obviously the financial cost of ingesting too much protein?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's as you do see people going quite overboard with it. It's an interesting one, and I think the reason for the apparent negative effects of protein on kidney health stem from sort of old research or even just anecdotal observations of taking people with chronic kidney disease, reducing their protein intake, and therefore their kidney health's improved. Whereas people then apply like a reverse causation and then think that if you're consuming high protein, it's going to lead to kidney disease, whereas that's not necessarily true. And there's been plenty of evidence showing that subjects consuming high amounts of protein have typical renal health, kidney health, and yeah, it just doesn't seem to be apparent. And one of the most famous studies of recently is by Jose Antonio, and he fed participants around 4.4 grams per kilo per day, which is it's double what I'm recommending and what some people consider high, and they showed no adverse effects on kidney function. Granted, it was only a relatively short study, I think 6 weeks off the top of my head, or maybe 10 to 12 weeks. But even in that time, in terms of the markers and stuff, there was no increase in sort of markers of kidney damage and or putting extra strain on the kidney, rather. If someone's got true kidney issues, or maybe they've got one kidney, then it's worth cutting back and maybe focusing on the higher quality protein sources, so you're getting the most bang for your buck from that. But that's really a conversation with your GP or a specialist regarding that, rather than I wouldn't really take any. Just to be clear, if someone has got any kidney issues, I'd rather them take the advice from a medical professional rather than from a podcast. So.
Definitely, yeah, we're gonna put that one out there.
Just helps you and me getting sued if someone thinks to.
Yeah, Ian and Joseph said. What about digestion from over intake? Because obviously people can complain of poor digestion, farting basically, Joseph.
Yeah, I think it depends on the protein source. I think most people tend to have more issues with more dairy-based, the typical protein farts from too much whey or casein. That in part might be due to mixing it with milk and some of the lactose in that. In most people, as long as they've got sort of sufficient stomach acid and they can digest protein properly, because protein does require a lot more effort to digest it, especially if you take something like a steak. It is quite tough. So to break that down into the sort of tripeptides, which are going to be absorbed and used and incorporated in muscle potentially, then that's going to require a lot of breaking down in the stomach. It's going to take time to do that. So if someone to eat like a 12-ounce steak, it's probably going to take around 12 hours to completely digest that. With whey, for instance, it's relatively quick, around the sort of 10 grams per hour mark. So if you were to take a whey protein shake, within sort of 3 or 4 hours, that's going to be completely digested. So it depends on the protein source. It depends on the individual. If you do have issues, it might be worth limiting it to a certain amount at a given meal time and separating that according to the recommendations that we've just been through. So probably around
trial and error.
Yeah, definitely. I think most of the issues would be primarily to do with the protein source. But if quantity is an issue, then just simply spread that intake over a greater number of meals in that given day.
Awesome. So we've talked about quantity, we've talked about distribution, quality, we've talked about now timing. Are we referring to like the kind of the workout window as timing?
Yeah, so Yeah, because this distribution and timing is sort of interrelated in a way
Yeah,
because the way you distribute is going to obviously be according to a set time frame. But when we talk about protein time, it's generally referring to either before bed, so like a pre-bed timing, or post-exercise, that around workout nutrition. In terms of the optimal amount to consume, so a lot of people listening have probably heard like you've got to, and I'm sure you've heard it multiple times, that you've got to consume protein within sort of 10 or 15 minutes of finishing your workout to get the maximum benefit. There's certainly no harm in doing that, and the sooner the better, really, because it just ensures that you've got that protein feeding ticked off. Although if you were to eat, say, an hour or two before a workout, then realistically, if you consume a meal within an hour or two after that exercise bout, you're going to be fine, and there's likely not going to be any additional benefit of consuming that immediately after the workout, because like we discussed previously, if you consume a typical protein meal, and that's going to take 3 or 4 hours to absorb, unless you consume that meal and wait around for all day and then go to the gym, there's no real need to consume that straight after the workout. It's still going to be, you're still going to be digesting your pre-exercise meal when it comes to immediately post-workout. So delaying that a little bit isn't going to matter. It's not going to matter much either way, whether you consume or you wait an hour and then consume. But probably a safe mark is probably within 90 minutes, and that gives people time then to finish the workout, have a shower, drive home, prepare a meal, and then eat it. It just sort of, more than anything, it's just that peace of mind, knowing that your gains aren't just flooding away post workout, which a lot of people seem to think is the case.
yeah. They seem to forget about this big picture and focus on this kind of acute moment within 20 minutes of this anabolic window. When I think it was,
Yeah.
I think it was Brad
Yeah,
Schoenfeld who said it was more like an anabolic barn door or something like that.
yeah, it's a good analogy, because the research generally, and a lot of this is done by Stu Phillips, they've shown that the anabolic response to a workout, so the increase in protein synthesis due to exercise alone, is elevated for around 24 to 72 to 48 hours. So in actual fact, that anabolic window is the next sort of day and a half, 2 days. So it's the number of meals and the protein you eat within that time frame that's going to determine the response to the training, not the meal that you consume within an hour after the workout.
Awesome. So if we look at, we touched on it briefly about vegans. What are their kind of main concerns from a kind of more vitamin and mineral response to their choices, because they're essentially eliminating an entire food group?
Yeah, so the main ones are calcium, as most vegans don't consume. Well, I wouldn't say most don't consume enough, but it's high. There's generally a high requirement because of low absorption of the calcium that vegans do get. This is mainly because of the oxalates that's found in some sort of vegetarian sources, like spinach, for example, which would, even though that food's got calcium in it, the absorption because of the oxalates would be pretty much negligible. So stuff like kale and bok choy and broccoli have low oxalates. So a vegan listening to this, I'd advise them to consume those choices for their calcium intake. So mainly increasing that sort of green veg to offset the reduction in calcium. And yeah, because the majority of people's calcium source, and especially in Western diets, tends to be dairy, so like milk, whey protein, yeah, and things like that. So, and a lot of breakfast cereals now are fortified with calcium. So generally, it's not that much of an issue. But if someone is a vegan, then calcium would be one to focus on. Protein's another one which we've discussed, and there's solutions to that, like we've just been through, or either to consume more of it or to fortify it with like a free leucine supplement to up the quality without needing to necessarily up the total quantity. Iron is another one that tends to be lower in vegan diets. Um, so there's two types of iron. There's heme iron, which is got an absorption of around 15 to 35%, which is mainly found in animal sources, which isn't really affected by stuff like that can inhibit the absorption, whereas vegan diets are exclusively non-heme iron. So, and these non-heme iron sources have got absorption rates of around 2 to 15%. So for vegans, oftentimes the iron requirements are double that of non-vegans because of the harder time actually absorbing that. Good. So in terms of the absorption issue, so it's phytates found in like stuff like grains and legumes and polyphenols that tend to reduce the absorption of the non-heme iron sources. That tend to reduce the absorption. So it's best to consume sort of non-heme iron sources away from the consumption of those foods, so consuming them sort of separately, and things that enhance the absorption of them, so get close to that 15%. Stuff like vitamin C, so fruit juice would be useful along with like vitamin A. Probably a word of caution on iron. It's probably only worth supplementing if there is iron deficiency. Anemia is diagnosed, so I'd go by a blood test or a doctor's opinion on whether to supplement with iron or not. I think just supplementing it willy-nilly can cause some potential issues. In terms of other vitamins, so B12 is the active form is only found in animal products. So lacto-ovo vegetarian, so those that consume everything but meat essentially will be fine, but vegans would need to consume foods fortified with B12 or just a simple supplement. It's a really easy fix in a way, and that's probably the only real hole in a vegan's diet that needs filling with a supplement or some sort of fortification, which is essentially a supplement. You're supplementing the food. But creatine, so anyone who's sort of weight training or anything like that would probably respond better to creatine if they're a vegan, purely because creatine's found mainly in sort of meats and other animal products. So if you take that out of the equation, then vegans are going to have far less resting creatine levels than your average meat eater. So they'll probably respond better to creatine, which is a positive. But they aren't getting the same benefits as someone who's eating meat with sort of naturally higher creatine levels. Probably the finer one is zinc. So zinc's got a lower bioavailability in vegan diets. So there is risk of depletion. So it is worth supplementing a vegan diet with zinc. So that's a pretty much a good summary around the vegan aspects in terms of the vitamin and mineral supplementation and just general supplementation.
Yeah. And just go back to the overall quantity of a training vegan, would their requirements be higher than as well? Like you said, for baseline it was maybe up to 1.2 for just a normal individual. Would it be higher than 2 grams for a training individual?
They would be theoretically the same. So if a vegan is so I work with a vegan bodybuilder at the minute.
I was just watching it on YouTube there.
Okay, yeah, it's he's on around 2.2 to 2.4 grams per kilo. He takes a lot of supplements because to reach that intake from just purely plant-based sources, you're going to end up consuming a lot of carbohydrates. So he supplements a lot. He also consumes added and fortifies some meals with added leucine to reach those sort of minimum leucine intakes per meal to maximize protein synthesis. So the total amount doesn't really change if you are focusing on higher quality vegan sources. Is slightly higher if you're just relying purely on vegan foods.
Awesome.
But in terms of the general recommendations, that the function or the aim's the same, to maximize protein synthesis and stuff. So yeah, the total amount shouldn't really change. It only change according to the lack of quality.
And are things like hemp and pea protein a good kind of option for vegans?
Yeah, so yeah, pea and hemp are good. So you probably need around 39 to 45 grams of pea or hemp protein to maximize or to hit that 3 grams of leucine. So for round two, you're probably talking around the 25 to 30 gram mark, which isn't a lot, and it's certainly doable. So if you're opting for sort of supplements as a vegan, sort of the pea, hemp, soy's good as well. Soy's got a bit of a bad rap because
Yeah.
people perceive it to lower sort of testosterone and cause sort of estrogenic adaptations and so on. But so far, the research hasn't really shown anything. And in my advice would be just to err on the side of caution with soy, if anything, and maybe put a limit of around 50 grams of protein from soy sources, and that'd be absolutely fine.
Oh, brilliant. I mean, that links us nicely to supplements, and that ticks off the soy question I had. So, we're talking whey has been the best source of kind of protein supplement out there.
Yeah. So whey's the most quickly absorbed of a whole protein source, and it's generally got the highest leucine content of around sort of 12% for a really good whey isolate. And the research that's compared whey versus soy versus casein has always shown whey to be number one in terms of maximizing that muscle protein synthesis response. So it's the cheapest, it tastes good, it's the most convenient. For people who've got like a dairy allergy, then maybe something like soy would be the better option, or like a pea or hemp, but they generally taste a lot worse than
Yeah.
dairy protein. Dairy proteins taste the best out of any type of protein. I think like when you consume a lot of the vegan ones, they're quite bitty. They tend to make the drink quite thick, so you end up having to put a lot of consuming a thick, bitty solution isn't the most appetizing for people. I bought because I tried different proteins just to see what they're like on occasion, and I think it was a vegan one, like a vegan blend from My Protein. It gives you a sore throat every time you take it because it sort of scratches it with all the bittiness. So
Yeah.
if you're not a vegan, then I just recommend whey protein across the board. It's the cheapest, it's the most convenient. If you get an isolate as well, even if you've got lactose intolerance, it shouldn't be an issue because the lactose is removed. If it's less than a gram of carb per serving, it's not going to be an issue.
While we're on the subject, is pea and hemp much more expensive than whey?
I think it depends on the supplier, but I'd have to double check, but I wouldn't think that. Maybe they're slightly more expensive, but probably not by much. It wouldn't be something that would make someone definitely go towards one or the other because of a massive difference in price. I don't think that the price point is that different.
I've got this is something that I talk to my clients a lot, and a question that I get asked: BCAAs, yay or nay?
I'd say nay in most instances. Probably the only. Actually, I can't think of any real scenario where I would encourage the use apart from
Fasted training or?
Yeah, but then it's easy just to consume 20 grams of whey, because if you're going to consume to get a benefit from it, you have to consume quite a lot of branched chain amino acids, probably around the sort of 50 to 25 gram mark anyway. So it's easy just to consume that as a whey shake, which is going to taste nicer, it's going to be cheaper. And 25 grams of a whey isolate is already going to contain around 12 grams of BCAAs anyway. So, because a lot of protein supplements now, they say, with BCAAs, whereas whey protein's got BCAAs in by default. Anyway, I think the reason they put that on because people who aren't into nutrition or don't really read up around it probably aren't aware that whey naturally contains BCAAs anyway, so they think they're getting more for the money. So That's probably why BCA supplements have been quite popular, because people see them as this sort of separate or like an enhanced amino acid or something special, where they're not. They're contained in any protein source within a sort of given percentage. And part of the reason why they're not as good is because they can potentially stimulate protein synthesis, but if you stimulate protein synthesis, that isn't enough unless there's other amino acids to be synthesized. Essentially, you're just sending a signal, but there aren't the other amino acids there, the other essential amino acids to be synthesized or incorporated into new muscle. So an analogy that a lot of people have used is, if you imagine that the signal of protein synthesis is like a foreman telling a bricklayer to build a wall, for example, then it's with BCAs, it's like the bricklayer having no bricks. So you can send him the signal you want, but he's not going to build a wall. Yeah. Whereas a whole protein is, using the same example, he has got the bricks there. So yeah, he can respond to that signal.
I'll use that. I'll steal that one. For me, like, the taking BCAs, it's very habitual, and I'll just tell people, get some sugar-free Ribena or something, because that's going to be as useful.
Yeah, because some people feel they train better with it. Maybe they do, maybe because they're getting, maybe it's placebo, maybe because of the bitterness of it. Because there is some evidence actually that taking a bitter solution can improve cycling performance. I think it's just because of the effect on the brain, and maybe because it tastes bad in general. It might wake people up in the morning, so they can train a little bit harder. But who knows? I think it's easy just to either consume some carbohydrate before workout, and if someone's getting up at say 6 a.m. or 5:30 to train, so consuming a meal beforehand isn't realistic, or they don't tend to react favorably to consuming whey immediately before a workout, then they can just train fasted, providing they've had some protein the evening before. They won't be long fasted. So say if they consume protein at 10, they probably wouldn't finish digesting that till the early hours. So as long as they consume some whey protein, whatever, immediate following the training, they'll be fine. So I find it difficult to really come up with a scenario where I would recommend branched chain amino acids. In terms of fortification, it's best just to fortify with leucine, because the branched chain amino acids compete with each other for absorption, whereas it's the leucine that you want to be absorbed as opposed to the isoleucine and the valine.
Next, I kind of want to just touch on, because again, you've said it and it links nicely, protein fortified food. I think like there seems to be this big trend of every bar out there has now protein stuck on the front. So we've got Milky Ways and Yorkies and Kit Kats and all of this sort of stuff. What's your feeling on, and now cereals as well, protein, Weetabix?
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I did a post about I think it was the Weetabix or the Shreddies, like the Protein Max one. I think it might be Weetabix. I think they're probably owned by the same company anyway. Cover it. There's 3 or 4 grams per serving versus 5 grams, whereas the difference of a gram of wheat protein is going to do absolutely nothing. But the way they get around with the marketing, they say, well, this with say 125 milliliters of semi-skim milk is going to give you say 11 grams of protein, and they can sort of market it that way. I think it's because people have become a lot more conscious of protein, and protein now is synonymous with sort of weight loss and muscle gain and sort of toning and stuff. So people now are using the word protein just to sell, or trying to sell foods that otherwise are probably low in protein, or they might be higher in protein, but they're just sticking the word protein on now just to try to sell them. It's like if you see the corn adverts and the things like that, they say like a great source of protein, which it's not too bad. It's not as good as getting a chicken breast though.
It's given it this kind of health halo.
Yeah, exactly. It's like the new organic, isn't it? It's like organics not died down. People still tend to buy it, but not everything's sort of as fiercely labeled as organic now. And gluten-free is another one, isn't it, that people tend to gravitate towards and assume that it's going to be better for them because it's not containing gluten. Whereas in reality, for anyone who's not a celiac or not got a sensitivity to gluten, is going to be absolutely fine eating it. And the gluten-free options tend to taste a lot worse anyway. I
Yeah.
don't know if you've ever tried gluten-free bread. Yeah, it tastes quite cardboardy because the gluten gives it that sort of that gluey sort of doughy feel to sort of bread and other confectionery that makes it a lot more palatable
Yeah.
than
Gluten
sort of
makes
like
things taste awesome, basically.
yeah,
um,
that's true.
yeah, so basic, it's just an excuse for them to hire an extra couple of quid on things, in my eyes.
Yeah, yeah, that's the thing. It's like they're trying to come up with a new product. So creating like a protein version of Shreddies, for example, is it might make your sort of your average gym goer that doesn't really read into any of the research and stuff, or doesn't really read into nutrition in general. They think, oh, protein, that's going to be better, without actually looking on the back and realizing that, yeah, they might be getting an extra 2 grams of protein a day, which is it's going to do absolutely nothing in the scheme of things.
And the quality of that protein's questionable
It's pretty poor, yeah. Yeah, wheat protein is one of the worst protein sources.
because it's cheap as chips.
Yeah, it's yeah, people call it like a third world protein because it's good enough to keep someone alive, but it's not the ideal choice. Certainly, if you were starving, you
Oops. Hello, sorry, I just lost you there, Joseph. Say that again. Something about if you were starving.
yeah, sorry, mate. It's yeah, I noticed it flashing, and I suppose you can cut that bit out, can't you? From
Oh, I'll just leave it, man. I'm not all up in this editing. I ain't got time for that.
yeah. It's a good job I haven't been swearing then. I suppose it doesn't really matter anyway.
Oh,
Yeah.
don't listen to the
It
other
depends.
podcasts. I don't know where I don't know where I stand with swearing because I am from the northeast.
Yeah, I suppose
The F word tends to creep into my vocabulary now and then, but when I have guests on, I just test the water and see if they swear and if it's a go.
yeah.
Say.
Yeah, I generally trying to keep it like just day to day. Yeah, you swear a little bit more than you would
Yeah.
do. In writing, I generally don't because you're more conscious of what you're typing, and you haven't got time. You've got more time to process what you're thinking. So, but yeah, I was just saying that yeah, if you were starving and stuff, it's certainly going to keep you alive. A wheat-based protein or any protein source that's really fit for humans is going to be sufficient for survival. But in terms of optimizing protein synthesis and stuff, then a wheat protein isn't really going to cut it unless you're consuming a ton of it.
Yeah, brilliant. Wait, we're coming up to the 50 odd minute mark now on the recording, so I think we've kind of done well there in covering any proteins. Is there anything that you can think of that we might have missed out on?
Um, no, no, not really. I think it's I think we've covered the main points, and I think if people were to implement what we've been through, then they won't go far wrong in terms of doing anything. But if people want any questions and stuff answering in a bit more detail, yeah, they can feel free to drop me an email or a message on Facebook or whatever.
Again, you link these things perfectly. How and where can people find you, Joseph?
Um, so my website's www.elitenutritioncoaching, all one word.com. And my Facebook page is facebook.com/Joseph Agu Nutrition, again, all one word. So you can either drop me a message through there or drop me an email that you can find on my site. And yeah, if there's anything you want any further clarification on or any research sending through or anything like that, then I'm happy to do that.
Awesome, and I'll pop everything into the show notes and make sure people head across to your Facebook page where you do put out some really good like kind of infographics and things like that.
Yeah, cheers, mate. I appreciate that.
No, man. Thank you very much, Joseph, for joining us today, and hopefully catch up with you down the line, mate.
Yeah, no, it's my pleasure, Ian. Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Thanks, man.